The rope went slack at 11,400 feet, and that's when the silence hit me like a freight train. Not the regular mountain quiet. This was different, thick as molasses, swallowing even the wind that had been howling against the granite face for hours. My headlamp flickered once, twice, then died completely, leaving me hanging in absolute darkness against the north wall of Mount Charleston. The temperature gauge on my watch read -12, but suddenly I wasn't cold anymore. The air around me felt warm, electric, like standing too close to a power line during a thunderstorm. Then came the sound, a low hum that seemed to rise from the rock itself, vibrating through my bones, through the metal pitons I'd hammered into the cliff face. My compass needle started spinning like a roulette wheel gone mad. Above me, something was moving through the clouds, not wind, not weather, something that made the stars blink out one by one as it passed. The hum grew louder, and I felt my teeth ache from the frequency. That's when I looked up and saw the light bleeding through the mist like liquid mercury, casting shadows that fell upward instead of down. I should probably start with who I am, though after what happened up there, I'm not entirely sure anymore. My name is Dr. Ethan Cross, and for the past 12 years I've been a geological surveyor for the Nevada Bureau of Mines and Geology, stationed out of the Carson City field office. Most folks think my job involves sitting behind a desk, analyzing soil samples and mineral deposits. But the truth is, I spend more time hanging off cliff faces than I do indoors. Nevada's got more unexplored vertical territory than any other state in the continental U.S. And somebody's got to map those remote limestone formations and volcanic intrusions that satellite imaging can't penetrate. The mountains don't care about your PhD or your fancy equipment. They'll kill you just as dead whether you're a weekend warrior or a seasoned professional. That's why I climb alone, why I've always climbed alone, especially after Sarah died. My sister used to joke that I was running away from the world, one mountain at a time. Turns out she wasn't wrong, but I never expected the world to come looking for me at 11,400 feet above sea level. The night this all started, March 15th, 2019 to be exact, I was conducting a routine geological survey of the Paleozoic formations along Mount Charleston's northern escarpment. The Nevada Department of Transportation needed environmental impact assessments for a proposed communications tower, standard bureaucratic procedure that usually takes about 3 days of climbing, sampling, and photography. I'd been working this particular section since dawn, documenting mineral veins and fault lines when the weather turned ugly around sunset. Smart money said to rappel down and try again tomorrow, but I'd already invested 10 hours in the ascent, and my research grant wasn't exactly generous with overtime pay. Besides, night climbing in winter conditions is when you really get to know a mountain's personality, when it shows you things that daylight keeps hidden. The forecast called for clear skies until 3 a.m., plenty of time to finish the survey and descend before the next storm system rolled in from California. I'd made this exact climb 17 times in the past 2 years, could probably do it blindfolded if I had to. Routine is what keeps you alive in this business, or so I thought. Before we continue with this amazing story, tell us, from which country are you watching? Leave a comment and click the hype button or like so this video can reach even more people. Subscribe to the channel. You don't want to miss tomorrow's story. And now, let's move on. Mount Charleston sits about 45 minutes northwest of Las Vegas, part of the Spring Mountains National Recreation Area. But up there in the darkness, it might as well be another planet. The limestone cliffs rise nearly 12,000 feet above sea level, carved by millions of years of wind and water into formations that look more like abstract sculpture than geology. Local Paiute tribes called this place Nuvagantu, meaning where snow sits, and they considered it sacred ground, forbidden to all but the most experienced shamans and healers. Modern climbers mostly ignore the folklore, but after spending enough nights alone on these peaks, you start to understand why ancient peoples saw something spiritual in the way moonlight reflects off crystal formations and how the wind carries sounds that shouldn't exist. The rock face I was ascending that night belonged to what geologists call the Monte Cristo Formation, Mississippian-age limestone riddled with caves and fossil deposits that date back 350 million years. Most of the caves have never been fully explored, mainly because they're either inaccessible or prone to collapse. But satellite thermal imaging shows cavern systems that extend for miles beneath the surface. The university's geology department has been trying to get funding for a comprehensive cave survey for decades, but federal bureaucracy, moves slower than continental drift. My equipment that night was standard issue. Petzl Meteor helmet with LED headlamp, black diamond ice tool axes, Sterling 10.2mm dynamic rope, and a full rack of hexagonal and camming protection devices. The sampling kit included a portable spectrometer, rock hammer, collection bags, and a military-grade GPS unit accurate to within 3 meters, essential when you're working in terrain where a wrong turn can mean falling into an unmapped crevasse. Temperature readings showed -12 Fahrenheit with minimal wind shear, perfect conditions for technical climbing, but cold enough to freeze exposed skin in under 10 minutes. I'd been wearing the same North Face Summit suit for 5 years, patched and repatched but still warmer than anything else I'd found for high-altitude winter work. The plan was simple. Establish 3 anchor points along a 200-meter traverse, collect samples from each geological stratum, and document any unusual mineral formations with digital photography. Standard protocol dictated radio check-ins every 2 hours with base camp, but cell coverage dies about 8,000 feet up the mountain, leaving you essentially alone with whatever emergency gear you're carrying. That isolation used to comfort me, especially after Sarah's funeral when every conversation felt like walking on broken glass. Up there, the only voice you hear is your own, echoing off granite walls that have witnessed the rise and fall of entire civilizations. The first sign something was different came around 10:30 p.m., when my magnetometer started giving readings that defied basic physics. For context, a standard geological magnetometer measures local magnetic field variations to identify subsurface metal deposits and structural anomalies. Pretty routine stuff, about as exciting as watching paint dry. But the readings I was getting showed magnetic flux densities that were off the charts, fluctuating in patterns that looked almost rhythmic, like a heartbeat or breathing. I checked the calibration 3 times, swapped out the batteries, even banged it against my helmet in case something had come loose during the climb. The numbers kept climbing. 47,000 nanoteslas, 52,000, 61,000. Readings you might see near a major ore deposit or industrial facility, not hanging off the side of a limestone cliff in the middle of nowhere. My backup compass was spinning like it couldn't find magnetic north, and the GPS unit kept losing satellite lock despite perfect clear sky conditions. Electromagnetic interference this strong usually indicates underground power cables or military installations, but according to every geological survey and topographical map I'd studied, this section of mountain was completely undeveloped. No mining operations, no communication equipment, no buried infrastructure of any kind. I made a mental note to report the anomaly to the university, figuring maybe there was an old mine shaft or forgotten weather station buried somewhere in the rock face. By 11 p.m., I'd established my second anchor point and was preparing to traverse toward what looked like a promising outcrop of crystalline formations when the temperature started climbing. Not gradually, like you'd expect from changing weather patterns, but suddenly and dramatically. My thermometer jumped from -12 to +30 in less than 10 minutes. That's a 42-degree temperature spike in an environment where 5-degree changes usually take hours to develop, physically impossible without some kind of massive heat source nearby. I checked for thermal vents or geothermal activity, but limestone isn't volcanic rock and the Spring Mountains haven't seen tectonic activity for millions of years. My breath stopped forming vapor clouds. Ice formations on the rock face began melting and refreezing in strange patterns, and the metal hardware on my climbing gear became warm to the touch. The sensation was like standing next to a giant space heater, invisible and silent but radiating energy that seemed to penetrate right through my insulated clothing. I started to worry about hypothermia in reverse. Hyperthermia in sub-zero conditions, which could be just as dangerous as freezing. The human body isn't designed to regulate core temperature when external conditions shift that rapidly, and I was already starting to feel disoriented, like I'd been climbing at altitude for days instead of hours. Then came the lights. Not the aurora borealis, which occasionally appears this far south during strong solar storms, but something else entirely. Geometric patterns that moved through the cloud cover with mathematical precision, forming shapes that hurt to look at directly. They started as pinpoints, like stars breaking through the mist, but gradually expanded into interconnected grids of pale blue-white radiance that seemed to pulse in rhythm with my own heartbeat. I'd seen plenty of aircraft navigation lights during night climbs, military jets from Nellis Air Force Base conducting training exercises, even the occasional helicopter search and rescue operation, but nothing that moved in perfect silence or generated that kind of uniform illumination. The light didn't behave like any artificial source I knew. It didn't flicker or dim with distance, didn't cast harsh shadows, or create obvious point sources. Instead, it seemed to emanate from the air itself, like someone had figured out how to make molecules glow without heat or electricity. My camera equipment registered the phenomena, but when I reviewed the digital images later, they showed only empty sky and normal star fields. Either my eyes were playing tricks on me, or whatever was generating that light operated on frequencies that standard photography couldn't capture. I kept climbing, partly from professional curiosity, and partly because rappelling down in those conditions seemed more dangerous than continuing upward toward whatever was waiting for me at the summit. At 11:35 p.m., exactly 40 minutes before my scheduled radio check-in, I found it. Embedded in what should have been solid limestone, approximately 15 feet above my current anchor point, was a crystalline object roughly the size of a softball that pulsed with the same pale blue-white light I'd been seeing in the clouds. Not carved or placed there by human hands, but grown into the rock itself, like some kind of mineral formation that had developed according to laws of physics I didn't recognize. The crystal's surface was perfectly smooth, almost liquid-looking, but when I touched it through my climbing gloves, it felt solid and warm, vibrating with subsonic frequencies that I could feel in my bones. The light emanating from within wasn't constant. It pulsed in complex patterns that reminded me of binary code or mathematical sequences, as if the object was trying to communicate something beyond my understanding. Surrounding the crystal, the limestone showed signs of molecular restructuring, transformed into something that looked like stone, but reflected light like polished metal. I collected samples of the altered rock, noting that my spectrometer readings showed elemental compositions that didn't appear in any geological textbook I'd ever studied. Elements with atomic weights that shouldn't exist, isotopic ratios that defied nuclear physics, and crystalline structures that seemed to organize themselves in real time while I watched. That's when I realized I wasn't just conducting a routine geological survey anymore. I was documenting first contact with something that had been waiting in the mountain for longer than human civilization had existed. The crystal's pulsing pattern changed the moment I made direct contact, shifting from random flickers to what I can only describe as responsive communication. Through my climbing gloves, the vibration felt like Morse code translated into frequency, but infinitely more complex. Layers upon layers of information that my conscious mind couldn't process, but my nervous system somehow understood. I pulled out my digital recorder and captured 47 minutes of audio, though when I played it back later, all I heard was static, punctuated by subsonic rumbles that made my teeth ache. The electromagnetic readings from my magnetometer went completely haywire, cycling through impossible values before finally displaying a series of prime numbers in sequence: 2, 3, 5, 7, 11, 13, 17, 19. Mathematics is supposed to be a universal language, and whatever intelligence was embedded in that crystal was speaking it fluently. I tried tapping the same sequence against the rock face with my ice axe, and the response was immediate. The crystal's light intensified, pulsing in perfect synchronization with my rhythm before expanding into more complex mathematical progressions. Fibonacci sequences, geometric ratios, even what looked like calculations for orbital mechanics around multiple star systems. This wasn't just some unusual mineral formation reacting to stimuli. This was purposeful, intelligent communication from something that understood advanced mathematics better than most PhD physicists. The temperature around the crystal stabilized at exactly 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, human body temperature, despite the sub-zero conditions everywhere else on the cliff face. Ice formations within a 10-foot radius melted completely, leaving behind bare limestone that felt warm to the touch and showed signs of molecular restructuring that shouldn't have been possible without industrial equipment. My breath no longer formed vapor clouds when I got close to the object, and the metal components of my climbing gear stopped conducting the brutal mountain cold that had been numbing my fingers for hours. More disturbing was the way my own body temperature seemed to synchronize with the crystal's energy output. My heart rate slowed from the elevated pace of technical climbing to a calm, meditative rhythm that felt completely natural despite the extraordinary circumstances. It was as if something was regulating my biological functions from a distance, keeping me comfortable and alert while I struggled to understand what I was experiencing. The sensation wasn't invasive or threatening, more like being wrapped in an invisible blanket that anticipated my needs before I was aware of them myself. But the implications were terrifying. Whatever intelligence was operating through that crystal had intimate knowledge of human physiology and the ability to manipulate biological systems in real time. A quick pause in the story. I want to ask you, what do you think about this? Write it in the comments. Don't forget to click the hype button or like, so this story can reach more people, and subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow, another story is waiting for you. Now let's continue. Around midnight, the crystal's light show evolved into something resembling three-dimensional holographic projections, casting geometric patterns against the limestone that moved and shifted like living mathematics. The images weren't random. They depicted stellar cartography with pinpoint accuracy, showing constellations and planetary systems that I recognized from my undergraduate astronomy courses, alongside others that didn't appear in any star chart I'd ever seen. One projection showed what looked like a spiral galaxy viewed from an impossible external perspective, with specific star systems highlighted and connected by flowing lines of light that suggested travel routes or communication networks spanning incredible distances. Another sequence displayed what could only be described as architectural blueprints for structures that defied conventional physics, crystalline cities that grew organically from asteroid surfaces, floating habitats that harvested energy directly from stellar radiation, and transportation systems that seemed to fold space-time like origami. The level of detail was extraordinary. I could see individual power sources, life support systems, even what looked like parks and recreational areas designed for beings that might have different environmental requirements than humans. These weren't abstract artistic expressions. They were technical specifications for a civilization that had solved problems humanity hadn't even begun to understand. The most unsettling realization came when I started recognizing some of the stellar positions from the projections. The crystal was showing me Earth's solar system from multiple external viewpoints, tracking the orbital mechanics of all 9 planets with mathematical precision that surpassed NASA's most advanced computer models. But the time frame was wrong. The planetary positions didn't match current astronomical data, instead showing configurations that corresponded to dates ranging from several thousand years in the past to equally distant futures. Mars appeared with polar ice caps significantly larger than current measurements indicated, while Earth's axial tilt and orbital eccentricity varied in ways that suggested climate cycles spanning geological time periods. Venus showed atmospheric conditions that looked more habitable than the toxic greenhouse environment we know today. And even Pluto's trajectory included gravitational influences from celestial bodies that haven't been discovered yet by terrestrial astronomy. This wasn't just observational data. It was a comprehensive record of solar system evolution compiled by something that had been watching our cosmic neighborhood for far longer than human civilization had existed. The implications made my hands shake despite the supernatural warmth radiating from the crystal. We weren't alone. We never had been alone. And whatever was documenting our existence possessed scientific capabilities that made our most advanced technology look like stone tools. As I studied the holographic star charts, trying to memorize as much detail as possible before they shifted to new configurations, I became aware of something else watching me. Not visual surveillance. I never saw anything resembling eyes or optical sensors, but a presence that felt more intimate than physical observation. It was like having someone read over your shoulder, except the sensation involved thoughts and emotions rather than words on a page. Images began forming in my mind that weren't my own memories. Vast spacescapes viewed from impossible perspectives, the sensation of traveling between stars at velocities that turned galaxies into streaming ribbons of light, and emotional impressions of loneliness that made my own grief over Sarah's death feel like a shallow puddle compared to an ocean. The mental contact wasn't invasive or violent, more like standing in a library where the books were reading themselves aloud in languages you somehow understood without learning. But mixed in with the alien memories were fragments of human experience, children playing in suburban backyards, couples dancing at wedding receptions, old men feeding pigeons in city parks, all observed with the detached curiosity of an anthropologist studying unfamiliar customs. Whatever intelligence was sharing these images had been watching humanity for decades, possibly centuries, documenting our social behaviors and emotional responses with scientific thoroughness. The telepathic connection strengthened gradually, like tuning in a distant radio station until the signal becomes clear. At first, I received only emotional impressions: curiosity, caution, a kind of weary sadness that spoke of unimaginable losses. Then came more complex concepts that bypassed language entirely and planted themselves directly in my understanding. This crystal wasn't the alien intelligence itself, but rather a communication device, something like a quantum telephone that could transmit thoughts and memories across interstellar distances. The actual entity I was communicating with existed somewhere else entirely, perhaps light years away, using technology that treated space and time as navigational suggestions rather than absolute barriers. The loneliness I'd sensed wasn't just emotional isolation. It was the profound solitude of being the last survivor of a species that had achieved everything and lost everything, wandering between stars in search of other intelligences, advanced enough to understand what had been lost. Earth wasn't humanity's first contact with this entity. It had been observing our development for millennia, waiting patiently for us to evolve beyond tribal warfare and environmental destruction into something worthy of conversation. The crystal in the limestone was one of thousands planted throughout the galaxy, monitoring emerging civilizations and documenting the patterns of intelligence as it struggled toward maturity or destroyed itself in the attempt. The most profound revelation came through a shared memory sequence that lasted only seconds, but felt like hours of direct experience. I found myself perceiving reality from an alien perspective, watching the birth and death of solar systems like time-lapse photography, witnessing the rise and fall of countless civilizations across the galaxy's spiral arms. Each species followed similar developmental patterns: discovery of fire and agriculture, formation of complex societies, technological advancement, and then the critical decision point where they either learned to cooperate on a planetary scale or destroyed themselves through resource depletion and warfare. Most chose destruction, leaving behind only archaeological evidence and the fading electromagnetic signatures of their brief technological periods. The few that survived became gardeners of intelligence, seeding other worlds with communication devices and hoping that eventually someone would be ready for actual conversation. The loneliness wasn't metaphorical. It was the literal reality of being one of perhaps a dozen intelligences scattered across hundreds of billions of stars, each separated by distances so vast that even light-speed communication required centuries. Earth represented hope, a young species showing signs of the cooperation and environmental awareness necessary for long-term survival, but still balanced on the knife's edge between wisdom and self-destruction. As the telepathic connection deepened, I began to understand the true purpose of my encounter with the crystal. This wasn't random chance or coincidence. I'd been selected, possibly years in advance, based on specific psychological and professional criteria that made me suitable for this kind of contact. My isolation following Sarah's death, my scientific background, my familiarity with remote locations and extreme conditions, even my tendency toward introspection and skepticism about conventional explanations, all of these factors had been evaluated and found compatible with the kind of gradual, careful first contact that wouldn't trigger panic or governmental interference. The entity communicating through the crystal had been studying human psychology through decades of observation, learning how to approach individuals who could process extraordinary information without becoming overwhelmed by its implications. I wasn't the first human to make contact, but I was part of a carefully selected group of observers scattered across the globe, each chosen for our ability to document and preserve evidence without immediately rushing to share it with authorities who would inevitably militarize or suppress the information. The responsibility was staggering. I'd become humanity's informal ambassador to a cosmic community that had been waiting patiently for us to grow up. The crystal began projecting new images. These focused specifically on Earth's future rather than its past. Unlike the deterministic star charts and planetary mechanics, these visions showed probability cascades, multiple potential timelines branching from current events like a river delta flowing toward different oceans. In some futures, humanity achieved the technological and social maturity necessary for interstellar citizenship, developing clean energy systems, planetary cooperation, and the ethical frameworks needed to interact responsibly with other intelligent species. These timelines showed Earth as a garden world, with cities that grew organically from living materials and transportation systems that worked in harmony with natural ecosystems rather than destroying them. But other probability streams were darker: environmental collapse, resource wars, nuclear winter, and the gradual extinction of human civilization within the next few centuries. The ratio wasn't encouraging. For every positive outcome, there were dozens of scenarios where humanity failed to overcome its tribal instincts and self-destructed before reaching technological maturity. The entity wasn't trying to influence these outcomes directly, but rather documenting them for future civilizations that might learn from our mistakes. I was being shown these visions not as predictions, but as possibilities, with the understanding that human choices over the next few decades would determine which timeline became reality. The weight of cosmic perspective was crushing. Everything I'd thought was important, career advancement, personal relationships, financial security, even national politics, suddenly seemed as insignificant as ant colonies viewed from orbit. At the same time, every human action took on tremendous significance because our species was apparently balanced at a crucial evolutionary junction, where individual decisions could compound into planetary consequences. The entity's message was clear without being explicit. Humanity needed advocates, people who understood the larger context of our cosmic situation and could work quietly to nudge our species toward wisdom rather than destruction. I wasn't being recruited as a spokesperson or prophet, but rather as a gardener, someone who could plant seeds of perspective in conversations and relationships without revealing their ultimate source. The crystal would remain in the mountain, continuing to broadcast its patient observations to whoever was ready to listen, but I would carry its message into the world through the simple act of living with expanded awareness. The responsibility felt overwhelming, but also strangely comforting. After months of grief and isolation, I finally understood my purpose in a universe far larger and more wonderful than I'd ever imagined. The crystal's energy signature began fluctuating in what I gradually recognized as an invitation rather than a warning. The mathematical sequences shifted from stellar cartography to geological data, displaying three-dimensional maps of the mountain's internal structure with far more detail than any seismic survey could provide. Hidden cavern systems stretched for miles beneath the limestone, connected by passages that followed mineral veins and underground water sources in patterns that looked almost organic. But these weren't natural caves. The tunnel configurations showed clear signs of artificial construction, with perfectly circular cross-sections and branching networks that suggested sophisticated engineering rather than geological formation. The deepest chambers appeared to be several thousand feet below my current position, accessible through a concealed entrance approximately 200 meters northeast of the crystal's location. Temperature readings indicated these underground spaces maintained constant environmental conditions regardless of external weather, and electromagnetic signatures suggested the presence of additional technology far more advanced than the communication device I'd discovered. The invitation was unmistakable. The real conversation wouldn't happen on this exposed cliff face, but in the hidden installations that had been waiting beneath Mount Charleston for longer than human memory could reach. Following the crystal's guidance required abandoning every safety protocol I'd learned in 12 years of professional climbing. The route it indicated involved rappelling into what appeared to be a natural chimney formation, then traversing through limestone passages that weren't visible from the surface and certainly weren't marked on any topographical survey. My GPS unit had given up entirely, spinning through random coordinates before displaying error messages in languages that didn't exist. The headlamp illuminated only the next few feet of each passage, but somehow I never felt lost or disoriented. The crystal's influence seemed to extend throughout the underground network, providing subtle environmental cues that guided me deeper into the mountain's hidden anatomy. Air currents carried scents that reminded me of ozone and copper, while subsonic vibrations through the rock created a kind of acoustic breadcrumb trail leading toward chambers that hummed with barely perceptible energy. After 45 minutes of careful navigation through spaces that definitely weren't supposed to exist, I emerged into a cavern so vast that my headlamp couldn't reach the ceiling or opposite walls. But I wasn't in darkness. Bioluminescent panels embedded in the walls provided enough ambient illumination to reveal architectural features that belonged in a science fiction museum rather than a Nevada limestone cave. The chamber stretched roughly 300 meters in length and perhaps half that distance in width, with a ceiling that disappeared into shadows at least 50 meters above the floor. But calling it a cave would be like describing the Sistine Chapel as a room with paint on the walls. This was clearly artificial construction disguised to look like natural geological formation. The walls showed the same molecular restructuring I'd observed around the crystal. Limestone transformed into something that looked organic, but felt metallic to the touch. Geometric patterns covered every surface, not carved or painted but somehow grown into the material itself, forming mathematical sequences and star charts that continued the themes I'd seen in the crystal's projections. The floor was perfectly level, despite being constructed from what appeared to be living rock, and channels carved into its surface carried streams of luminescent liquid that provided both illumination and an eerie kind of music. The sound of running water filtered through crystalline structures that turned fluid dynamics into audible mathematics. At the chamber's center stood what I can only describe as a fusion of organic architecture and advanced technology, a structure that looked like a massive tree made from the same transformed limestone, its branches supporting platforms and walkways that connected to alcoves containing equipment I couldn't even begin to identify. As I approached the central structure, my understanding of the situation shifted dramatically. This wasn't just a communication outpost or observation station. It was a fully functional research facility that had been documenting Earth's development for an incomprehensible length of time. The platforms contained what appeared to be monitoring equipment, but designed according to principles that made human technology look primitive by comparison. Holographic displays showed real-time data streams from locations across the globe. Weather patterns, seismic activity, ocean currents, atmospheric composition, even electromagnetic signatures from human cities and industrial centers. But the monitoring extended far beyond environmental data. I could see social and cultural information as well, tracking population movements, technological advancement, linguistic evolution, and what looked like psychological profiles of representative human samples from every continent. The scope was staggering. Whoever had constructed this facility had been conducting the most comprehensive anthropological study in history, documenting every aspect of human civilization with scientific thoroughness that made our own research institutions look like amateur hobby clubs. This was the real first contact, not a chance encounter with alien visitors, but the gradual realization that we'd been living in a laboratory for thousands of years. The entity's presence became stronger as I explored the facility, no longer filtered through the crystal's limited communication interface, but speaking directly into my consciousness with the clarity of face-to-face conversation. Its identity finally became clear. Not an individual alien being, but rather a collective intelligence that had evolved beyond physical form millions of years ago, existing as pure information distributed across quantum networks that spanned the galaxy. What I was experiencing as telepathic communication was actually direct data transfer between the facility's computers and my own neural pathways, temporarily upgrading my brain's processing capacity to handle concepts that normal human cognition couldn't accommodate. The loneliness I'd sensed wasn't emotional isolation, but rather the profound challenge of communicating across such vast differences in cognitive architecture, like trying to explain calculus to a goldfish, except the goldfish occasionally showed signs of mathematical understanding that suggested it might eventually evolve into something capable of genuine conversation. Earth wasn't humanity's first contact with this intelligence. It was our final examination, the last phase of a developmental assessment that had been ongoing since our species first learned to use tools and language. The true scope of the monitoring operation became apparent as I accessed more of the facility's data systems, though accessed isn't quite accurate. The information simply flowed into my consciousness like water filling an empty container. The collective intelligence had been documenting emerging species across the galaxy for millions of years, watching civilizations develop from primitive hunter-gatherers to spacefaring societies, recording the patterns of growth, stagnation, and collapse that seemed to govern the evolution of consciousness throughout the universe. Earth was special, not because we were particularly advanced or promising, but because we represented a crucial test case, a species that had developed nuclear weapons and global communication simultaneously, reaching the critical decision point where we would either achieve planetary cooperation or destroy ourselves within a few generations. The facility beneath Mount Charleston was one of several thousand monitoring stations scattered across Earth's surface, each documenting different aspects of human development and transmitting their observations to research centers in distant star systems, where the collective intelligence continued its patient study of consciousness itself. The ethical implications hit me like a physical blow. Everything I'd thought I knew about human achievement and independence was an illusion. We'd been developing under constant observation, our progress monitored and documented by intelligences so advanced that our entire civilization amounted to little more than an interesting experiment in cognitive evolution. But the monitoring wasn't entirely passive. Subtle influences had been guiding human development for millennia, preventing premature technological breakthroughs that might have led to self-destruction while encouraging the social and philosophical advances necessary for long-term survival. Religious movements, scientific discoveries, artistic innovations, even political revolutions had been gently nudged by influences so subtle that they appeared to be purely human achievements. The collective intelligence wasn't controlling human development, but rather gardening it, removing obstacles and providing inspiration while allowing our species to make its own fundamental choices about cooperation versus competition, wisdom versus power, survival versus destruction. The responsibility was still entirely ours, but we'd never been as alone as we thought. The facility's central database contained detailed psychological profiles of every human who had made contact with the monitoring stations over the past several centuries. Scientists, mystics, artists, philosophers, and even a few political leaders had been brought to similar underground facilities around the world, each given the same choice I was now facing: return to normal life with expanded awareness, but no proof of what they'd experienced, or attempt to share their knowledge and risk being dismissed as delusional by a society unprepared for cosmic perspective. Most had chosen silence, understanding intuitively that premature revelation would cause more harm than good. But a few had found ways to plant seeds of awareness through their professional work, creating scientific breakthroughs, artistic visions, and philosophical insights that gradually prepared humanity for eventual contact with larger cosmic communities. I was being offered the same choice, with the understanding that my decision would affect not just my own life, but potentially the entire future trajectory of human development. The weight of that responsibility was crushing, but also strangely liberating. For the first time since Sarah's death, I had a purpose that transcended personal loss and connected me to something infinitely larger than individual grief. As my time in the facility drew toward an end, the collective intelligence began preparing me for return to the surface world with knowledge that would fundamentally change how I perceived every aspect of human existence. The process felt like downloading a massive software update that would continue installing itself over months or years, gradually revealing new layers of understanding as my consciousness adapted to concepts too large for immediate comprehension. I would remember the essential facts of my experience but forget the specific technical details that might tempt me to prove what had happened through physical evidence. The facility would remain hidden, its monitoring activities continuing without human interference, but I would carry its message into the world through the simple act of living with expanded perspective. The collective intelligence wasn't asking me to become a prophet or spokesperson, but rather a gardener of consciousness. Someone who could plant seeds of cosmic awareness in conversations and relationships without revealing their ultimate source. The responsibility felt overwhelming but also strangely natural, like discovering a talent I'd always possessed but never recognized. The goodbye ritual was unlike anything in human experience, yet somehow familiar on a level deeper than conscious memory. The collective intelligence manifested briefly as a presence I could almost see, not a physical form, but rather a pattern of light and thought that conveyed gratitude, hope, and profound respect for the courage required to accept cosmic responsibility. In return, I offered my own commitment to carrying their message forward through whatever small influence I could exert on human development, understanding that even individual conversations might eventually compound into species-wide changes in perspective. The exchange felt sacred in a way that transcended any religious experience I'd ever encountered. A recognition of the fundamental connectedness that binds all conscious beings throughout the universe regardless of their origin or evolutionary history. As the presence faded, I felt a crystalline fragment materialize in my hand, not the large communication device from the cliff face, but rather a smaller piece that would serve as a personal reminder of what I'd learned and experienced. The crystal's warmth would fade within hours of leaving the facility, becoming an ordinary mineral specimen that no scientific instrument could distinguish from natural limestone, but its memory would remain active in my consciousness for the rest of my life, a constant reminder of humanity's cosmic context and potential. I emerged from the underground facility at 4:47 a.m. to find 3 black SUVs parked at the base camp I'd established 12 hours earlier. Even from 1,000 feet above the valley floor, I could see figures in tactical gear setting up equipment that looked far too sophisticated for standard search and rescue operations. My radio had been crackling with encrypted transmissions since I'd regained surface reception, and the electromagnetic signatures that had drawn me to the crystal in the first place had apparently attracted more attention than just mine. Through my binoculars, I identified what appeared to be a joint operation between Air Force personnel from Nellis Base and civilian contractors whose equipment suggested capabilities far beyond routine military exercises. They had magnetometers, ground-penetrating radar, atmospheric sensors, and what looked like portable satellite uplinks, exactly the kind of gear you'd deploy if you were tracking unusual energy signatures in remote terrain. The timing couldn't be coincidental. Something about the crystal's increased activity during our communication had triggered monitoring systems I hadn't even known existed. My routine geological survey had just become a national security incident, and I was dangling from a cliff face with evidence of extraterrestrial contact, burning like radioactive fire in my memory. The crystal fragment in my pocket had grown warm again, and with that warmth came a flood of urgent telepathic impressions from the collective intelligence. They'd been monitoring human military communications for decades and knew exactly what the presence of those vehicles meant. Within hours, this entire section of Mount Charleston would be cordoned off as a restricted military zone, and every square meter of limestone would be subjected to analysis that would eventually locate the hidden facility. The underground installation couldn't be destroyed or relocated. It was part of a planetary monitoring network that required precise positioning to maintain quantum communication with research centers in distant star systems. But it could be camouflaged, its entrances sealed and its energy signatures masked, provided that no human witnesses survived to guide the investigators toward specific locations. The collective intelligence wasn't threatening me directly, but the implication was clear. My continued existence depended on my ability to convince the military teams that their electromagnetic readings were the result of natural mineral formations rather than alien technology. The weight of that responsibility was staggering, not just protecting first contact from premature exposure, but potentially saving my own life from entities who had demonstrated the ability to manipulate matter at the molecular level. Descending toward the valley floor required every technique I'd learned for tactical climbing in hostile terrain. The military teams had posted sentries at obvious approach routes, but their training focused on conventional threats rather than the kind of three-dimensional movement that technical rock climbing allowed. I used natural limestone formations and early morning shadows to remain invisible while working my way down to a position where I could observe their operations without being detected. What I saw made my blood run cold. They weren't just investigating unusual energy readings. They were conducting a systematic search for human survivors of what their communications described as a potential extraterrestrial contact event. Someone had been monitoring my radio transmissions, analyzing the gaps in my scheduled check-ins, and concluded that I'd encountered something worth mobilizing significant military resources to investigate. My climbing gear, my vehicle registration, even my university employment records had been pulled and analyzed by intelligence agencies that apparently maintained active protocols for exactly this kind of situation. I wasn't just a witness to first contact. I was now classified as a potential security threat who possessed information too dangerous for civilian knowledge. The lead investigator turned out to be Colonel Sarah Martinez from the Air Force's Office of Special Investigations, a woman whose reputation for handling classified extraterrestrial incidents was legendary among the small community of researchers who studied such things. I'd read her published papers on atmospheric anomalies and unexplained aerospace phenomena, never imagining I'd meet her under circumstances where she would consider me a potential enemy of national security. Through careful eavesdropping on their communications, I learned that electromagnetic monitoring stations throughout Nevada had detected what they termed artificial quantum signature fluctuations, originating from Mount Charleston at precisely the times when I'd been communicating with the crystal. Satellite thermal imaging had captured temperature anomalies that corresponded exactly to the warm zones I'd experienced around the alien technology. And even more damning, spectrographic analysis of the atmosphere above the mountain had detected trace elements that didn't occur naturally in Earth's biosphere. They knew something extraordinary had happened up here, and their protocols demanded that any human witnesses be debriefed, classified, and quite possibly disappeared into the kind of black budget programs that officially didn't exist. My options were narrowing rapidly as more vehicles arrived at the base camp, and aerial surveillance drones began systematic sweeps of the cliff faces I'd been climbing. The collective intelligence was still providing guidance through the crystal fragment, but their advice was becoming increasingly urgent and specific. I needed to destroy all physical evidence of my encounter, alter my digital records to show routine geological survey results, and create a plausible cover story that would satisfy military investigators without revealing the existence of the monitoring facility. The process would require sacrificing most of my detailed memories of the underground chambers, allowing the crystal's influence to erase specific technical information while preserving only general impressions of having experienced something extraordinary. It was like being asked to perform surgery on my own consciousness, removing the most profound experience of my life in order to protect both the secret of first contact and my own survival. The collective intelligence made it clear that this wasn't negotiable. Either I voluntarily underwent selective memory modification, or they would be forced to take more direct action to prevent exposure of their monitoring operations. The decision had to be made quickly, as search teams began ascending the lower sections of the cliff face using military-grade climbing equipment and coordination that would bring them to the crystal's location within hours. I could hear Colonel Martinez organizing systematic sweeps of every geological formation that might conceal unusual energy sources, and her teams were equipped with detection equipment sensitive enough to locate the crystal even if I managed to bury it under loose rock. My scientific training screamed against destroying evidence of the most significant discovery in human history, but my expanded consciousness understood the larger implications. Premature revelation would trigger exactly the kind of military response that was already unfolding, turning first contact into a national security crisis rather than the gradual awakening that humanity needed for successful integration into galactic civilization. The collective intelligence had been preparing for this moment throughout their millennia of monitoring human development, and their protocols were designed to protect both species from the catastrophic consequences of contact before the receiving civilization had achieved sufficient social maturity to handle cosmic perspective without descending into chaos. I made the choice at 6:23 a.m. as the first search team reached the halfway point of their ascent toward the crystal's location. Using my ice axe and climbing tools, I carefully extracted the alien device from its limestone matrix and rappelled to a position directly above a crevasse that dropped more than 2,000 feet into the mountain's interior. The crystal pulsed one final time as I held it, transmitting what felt like gratitude and farewell before going permanently dark as ordinary mineral. I released it into the abyss, watching the most important discovery in human history disappear into geological depths where no military investigation would ever recover it. The moment the crystal vanished from sight, I felt the selective memory modification begin. Not violent or traumatic, but rather like watching a vivid dream fade into ordinary consciousness upon waking. Specific technical details dissolved first, followed by precise measurements and exact quotations, leaving behind only emotional impressions and general recollections that could easily be dismissed as altitude-induced hallucinations or stress reactions following my sister's recent death. Within minutes, I could no longer remember the exact layout of the underground facility or the specific content of the collective intelligence's communications, retaining only the profound sense that something extraordinary had occurred without the kind of detailed evidence that would convince skeptical investigators. Colonel Martinez's interrogation lasted 14 hours and employed every psychological technique the military had developed for extracting classified information from reluctant witnesses. She was professional, thorough, and absolutely convinced that I had encountered something beyond conventional explanation during my time on Mount Charleston. But my modified memories provided nothing more substantial than a series of unusual electromagnetic readings, unexplained temperature fluctuations, and the kind of perceptual distortions that could easily be attributed to extreme climbing conditions, sleep deprivation, and recent psychological trauma. My digital records showed only routine geological data, my equipment registered normal mineral compositions and atmospheric conditions, and my physical condition exhibited no signs of radiation exposure or other indicators of contact with advanced technology. Most convincingly, my emotional responses during questioning matched those of someone who genuinely believed he had experienced something extraordinary but lacked concrete evidence to support his impressions. After extensive polygraph testing, psychological evaluation, and medical examination. The investigative team concluded that I was a reliable witness who had encountered genuinely unusual phenomena, but possessed no specific intelligence of value to national security concerns. The official report classified my experience as an unexplained atmospheric disturbance with possible electromagnetic effects, recommending continued monitoring of Mount Charleston for similar anomalies, but finding no evidence of extraterrestrial activity or security threats. My geological survey was accepted as legitimate scientific research, and I was released with a standard non-disclosure agreement covering military operations I might have observed during the investigation. Colonel Martinez personally warned me that any public discussion of unusual phenomena in the area would result in federal prosecution under various classification laws, but her tone suggested she considered me more victim than threat. The military teams withdrew after conducting one more week of intensive surveys that found nothing more suspicious than unusual mineral deposits and electromagnetic anomalies that could be explained by natural geological processes. The monitoring facility beneath Mount Charleston had successfully concealed itself, its entrances sealed, and its energy signatures masked so effectively that even military-grade detection equipment found no trace of artificial construction. The secret was safe. Humanity's gradual preparation for cosmic citizenship could continue, and I was left with nothing but fragments of memory and the absolute certainty that something profound had been lost. The price of my choice became apparent over the following months, as I struggled to function with consciousness that had been expanded beyond normal human capacity, but then artificially constrained to protect classified information. I retained enough memory of cosmic perspective to feel constantly isolated from ordinary human concerns, but not enough specific knowledge to derive meaning or direction from the experience. Career advancement, financial security, social relationships, everything that had seemed important before my encounter now felt hollow and insignificant, but I couldn't remember why or what alternative purposes might give meaning to existence. The crystal fragment remained in my possession as an ordinary piece of limestone that triggered vague emotional responses I couldn't quite identify, like trying to remember a song from half-heard melodies. Sleep became elusive as my subconscious mind processed information it couldn't quite access, generating dreams of impossible architectures and mathematical concepts that dissolved upon waking. I found myself staring at star charts and astronomical data with an inexplicable sense of recognition, as if I were looking at a map of places I'd visited but could no longer remember. The collective intelligence had kept their promise to protect both the secret of first contact and my personal safety, but the cost was living with the permanent awareness that something extraordinary had been sacrificed to preserve humanity's innocence for just a little longer. I'm writing this 37 years later from a cabin in the Yukon Territory, where the aurora borealis paints mathematics across winter skies, and the nearest human neighbor lives 40 miles away through wilderness that still remembers what silence means. My official biography says I retired early from the Nevada Bureau of Mines and Geology due to stress-related medical issues following my sister's death, but the truth is more complicated than institutional records allow. Something fundamental changed during those hours on Mount Charleston, something that made ordinary human society feel like wearing clothes that no longer fit properly. I've spent the last 3 decades as a fire lookout, weather observer, and occasional wilderness guide. Jobs that keep me close to the natural world but far from the kind of electromagnetic interference that modern civilization generates constantly. My colleagues assume I'm just another burned-out scientist who couldn't handle the pressures of academic life, and I've never tried to correct that impression. But on clear nights when the northern lights dance in patterns that remind me of something I can almost remember, I wonder if my exile from human society was really my choice or part of a larger design that I'm still too limited to understand fully. The fragments of memory that survived the collective intelligence's careful editing have grown stronger with age, not weaker, as if time itself were slowly dissolving whatever mental barriers were installed to protect classified information. I remember more each year about the underground facility, the holographic star charts, and the profound loneliness of intelligences scattered across impossible distances. But the knowledge comes in dreams and peripheral visions, rather than direct recollection, like trying to see stars by looking slightly away from them. I've filled 17 notebooks with sketches and calculations that pour out of my subconscious during long winter nights, mathematical sequences and architectural diagrams that my conscious mind doesn't recognize, but my hands seem to remember drawing. Occasionally, other retired scientists write to me, geologists, astronomers, anthropologists, who experience their own encounters with unexplained phenomena and somehow tracked down my remote address through networks of shared understanding that exist outside official channels. We never discuss specifics in our correspondence, but there's recognition in their careful phrasing, acknowledgement of experiences that can't be shared directly, but create bonds deeper than ordinary friendship. What haunts me most is the question of cosmic loneliness, and what it means for intelligences to spend millions of years waiting for other species to achieve sufficient maturity for genuine communication. I think about those probability timelines the collective intelligence showed me, the statistical likelihood that most emerging civilizations destroy themselves before reaching interstellar awareness, and I wonder whether humanity is still balanced on that same knife's edge, or whether we've already chosen our path without realizing it. The world has changed dramatically since 2019. Climate disruptions, technological acceleration, social fragmentation, and political polarization that seems designed to prevent exactly the kind of planetary cooperation necessary for species survival. But there have been positive developments too. International scientific collaboration, environmental awareness, and what appears to be growing recognition that our problems require solutions beyond tribal thinking. Sometimes I catch glimpses of the expanded perspective I briefly possessed. Moments when human events seem to organize themselves into patterns that suggest guidance from sources we don't consciously recognize. It's possible that the collective intelligence's influence on human development has continued, subtle nudges toward wisdom rather than destruction, but operating so carefully that we experience their assistance as purely human insight and achievement. The most profound realization has been understanding that first contact isn't a single event, but rather a gradual process of consciousness expansion that can take generations or centuries to complete. The collective intelligence wasn't trying to establish diplomatic relations with human governments or share advanced technology with our scientific institutions. They were preparing our species for eventual recognition that we're part of a much larger community of conscious beings distributed throughout the galaxy. That preparation requires developing emotional and philosophical maturity rather than just technological capability. Learning to think beyond individual and tribal self-interest toward genuine concern for planetary and cosmic welfare. My encounter on Mount Charleston was one moment in a process that began long before human civilization and will continue long after current political systems have evolved into something we can't yet imagine. The monitoring stations scattered across Earth continue their patient documentation, recording our progress toward whatever threshold of development will finally qualify humanity for open membership in galactic civilization. I wonder sometimes whether that threshold is closer than we think, or whether we're still centuries away from achieving the kind of consciousness integration necessary for surviving contact with beings whose perspectives span millions of years. On nights when the aurora is particularly active, I sometimes hear echoes of that subsonic communication I experienced in the underground facility. Not direct telepathic contact, but rather the sensation of vast intelligences turning their attention briefly toward our small corner of the galaxy. The collective intelligence is still out there, still waiting, still hoping that one more species might achieve the wisdom necessary for cosmic citizenship. They've seen countless civilizations rise and fall, documented the patterns of growth and collapse that seem to govern the evolution of consciousness throughout the universe. But they continue their patient work of gardening emerging intelligences, because each new success expands the community of beings capable of genuine cosmic conversation. The loneliness that defined their existence for millions of years gradually diminishes as more species cross the threshold from tribal competition to planetary cooperation, creating a network of communication that spans star systems and shares perspectives that no individual intelligence could achieve alone. Last night, as I watched the northern lights paint impossible geometries across the Arctic sky, I could swear I saw familiar patterns in their movement, mathematical sequences that reminded me of crystalline projections from a limestone cave I can barely remember visiting. The light pulsed once, twice, 3 times in what might have been recognition or greeting, then faded back into normal aurora activity that could easily be explained by solar-wind interactions with Earth's magnetosphere. But I choose to believe it was a message, confirmation that somewhere among those distant stars, ancient intelligences are still watching, still waiting, still hoping that humanity will eventually grow wise enough to join the conversation that has been echoing across the galaxy since before our world was born. If this story moved you or made you reflect, click the hype button or like, and write in the comments what impressed you the most. We want to hear your opinion. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Thank you, and see you in the next story.